The war in the Pacific was unlike the war in Europe. It had no front lines in the usual sense, no major capitals that fell in a matter of days, and left no room for compromise. It was a war of attrition, where every piece of land was worth blood, and every island became a separate hell. It was in this logic of war that Iwo Jima appeared, a small piece of volcanic land that eventually became one of the bloodiest battles of the 20th century. By early 1945, the U.S. already had superiority in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet was almost destroyed, the Air Force suffered catastrophic losses, and American industry continuously supplied the troops with new ships, planes, and soldiers. But despite this advantage, the war was not coming to a quick end. Japan had no intention of surrendering. On the contrary, each defeat only strengthened its resolve to fight to the end. The American command realized that in order to force Japan to surrender, it would either have to deliver a blow that would break its ability to resist or create conditions for a direct invasion of the Japanese islands. Both options promised huge losses. That is why every decision was made coldly, cynically, and with mathematical precision. Iwo Jima became part of this calculation. Geographically, Iwo Jima was a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But its location gave it enormous strategic importance. The island lay between the Mariana Islands, where American B-29 bombers were based, and Japan itself. From Iwo Jima, the Japanese could intercept American planes, warn Tokyo of air raids, and strike at U.S. air routes. As long as the island remained in Japanese hands, every American air sortie was more dangerous than it could have been. For the U.S., Iwo Jima had another significance. It could become a staging area for aircraft, an emergency landing site for damaged planes, and a springboard for further offensives. American generals saw the island not just as a target, but as a tool that would shorten the war and, they believed, ultimately save lives, even if it meant sacrificing tens of thousands of soldiers now. The decision to attack Iwo Jima was not popular, nor was it easy. The generals understood that the Japanese would turn the island into a fortress. They already had experience fighting on Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, where every meter of land had to be fought for with terrible losses. But at the same time, they knew something else. If Iwo Jima was left behind, the Japanese defense would continue to damage American aviation, and the war would drag on. On the Japanese side, the decision was even tougher. Iwo Jima had to be held at all costs. It was not considered a temporary position or a bargaining chip. The Japanese command made it clear, the island should become a trap for the Americans, a place where they would drown in their own blood. The goal was not so much to win as to inflict such losses that the U.S. would reconsider the advisability of further offensive operations. Thus, Iwo Jima became a symbol of the clash between two worlds and two logics of war. For the U.S., it was a cold strategic calculation; for Japan, it was a matter of honor, self-sacrifice, and last resistance. A small island with no civilian population and no cities became hundreds of times more important than its size. From that moment on, the path to Iwo Jima became inevitable. The decision was made. The fleets began to move, the soldiers began to prepare, and the commanders began to make plans, knowing that what lay ahead was not just a battle, but a test of the limits of human endurance. The war was approaching its darkest phase. After the decision to storm Iwo Jima was made, the war took on a whole new dimension for the American High Command. Now it was no longer an abstract strategy, but a concrete route, concrete dates, and concrete people who would have to be thrown onto the volcanic shore. Preparations for the operation began long before the first Marine set foot on the island's black sand, and there was no room for illusions in these preparations. The American command was well aware that Iwo Jima would not be a quick victory. The experience of previous battles in the Pacific had taught them a harsh lesson: the Japanese do not surrender, do not retreat, and do not admit defeat even when the situation becomes hopeless. Each new island meant even more fortified defenses and even greater readiness for self-sacrifice. Iwo Jima was to be the culmination of this logic. A large-scale mobilization of forces began in the United States and at bases in the Pacific. The Marine Corps, already considered the elite of the American Army, was given the leading role in the upcoming assault. The units underwent accelerated but extremely rigorous training. Soldiers were prepared for battle in conditions of complete isolation, without a clear front line, amid rocks, ashes, and underground fortifications. Training was not limited to shooting and tactical maneuvers. The Americans were psychologically prepared for the fact that this battle would be different. Instructors spoke openly about losses, about the fact that many would not return. This was not motivation in the classical sense, it was acceptance of the inevitable. The soldiers had to understand that fear would not disappear, but they would have to live and fight with it. At the same time, the Navy was preparing for one of the largest naval operations of the war. Battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and landing ships were converging on Iwo Jima. The Pacific Ocean around the island was to be turned into a continuous zone of fire. The Americans planned to destroy everything they could before landing, hoping to break through the defenses before the soldiers set foot on shore. But here they faced a problem that they did not yet fully realize. The Japanese defense on Iwo Jima was not built as it had been before. They did not rely on the beaches or seek to drive the enemy into the sea. Instead, the Japanese turned the island into an underground fortress. Tunnels, bunkers, and hidden firing points that could not be destroyed by conventional bombing made even the most powerful artillery less effective. American intelligence had only a partial understanding of the scale of this system. Aerial photographs showed fortifications, but did not reveal the true depth of the defenses. Headquarters understood that the Japanese were preparing for defense, but few could imagine how thoroughly and fanatically it would be organized. Meanwhile, the Japanese garrison on the island was also preparing. For them, Iwo Jima was not just another defensive position, it was a place where they had to die in a way that would make their deaths meaningful. Soldiers were trained to wait, not to open fire immediately, to allow the Americans to land, gather, and feel the illusion of success, and only then to strike. It was a defense based on patience and cold calculation. When the American fleet began to move toward the island, most of the soldiers already knew that a quick battle was not in store for them. The sailors looked at the horizon, where Iwo Jima would soon appear, and understood that this piece of land already had a life of its own in their imagination. It was not just a target, it had become a symbol of how far the war had gone. A strange silence reigned on the ships. It was not the silence that precedes a celebration, nor the silence that comes from confidence. It was the silence of people who knew they had done everything possible to prepare, but still could not predict what would happen next. They were not going to victory, but to a test. Iwo Jima was approaching. With it came a battle that would erase any remaining illusions about an easy end to the war in the Pacific. The morning of February 19, 1945, began not with chaos, but with a deceptive silence. After days of continuous bombing, Iwo Jima seemed dead. From the sea, the island looked devastated, as if no living creature could have survived the barrage of fire that had rained down on it from American ships and planes. For many Marines, this seemed to indicate that the worst was over. It was the first and one of the most dangerous illusions of this battle. When the landing ships approached the shore, not a single shot was fired. There was no machine gun fire, no mortars, no artillery barrages. The Marines landed on the black volcanic sand with almost no resistance. Some thought that the Japanese defenses had been destroyed, others that the enemy had retreated deeper into the island. In fact, the Japanese were waiting. The black sand of Iwo Jima immediately revealed its hostile nature. It did not support weight, sucked in feet, and hindered the movement of equipment. Tanks got stuck, soldiers fell while trying to drag heavy equipment behind them. Any movement required effort, and any stop made a person an easy target. But the enemy was still silent. American units advanced deeper into the beach, gathering on a narrow strip of land between the sea and the first elevations. This was exactly what the Japanese were waiting for. When the shore was filled with people, equipment, and ammunition, the silence was suddenly broken. Massive fire opened from underground, from the slopes, and from camouflaged openings. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery fired accurately and mercilessly. The firing points were positioned so that they overlapped each other, creating areas of crossfire. The Marines, who had been advancing just a minute ago, were now pinned to the ground. There was almost no cover, and retreat meant an open path under fire. Panic quickly gave way to shock, and shock gave way to the cold necessity to act. Units lost their commanders in the first minutes of the battle. Communications were interrupted. The plan drawn up at headquarters crumbled under the pressure of reality. But despite this, the soldiers began to adapt. Small groups acted independently, looking for weak spots, crawling up to firing points, using grenades and flamethrowers. The Suribachi volcano, which towered over the southern part of the island, played a special role in the first hours of the battle. From its slopes, the Japanese controlled a significant part of the beaches, adjusting their fire and observing the movements of the Americans. Suribachi quickly became a symbol of danger, a dark shadow hanging over the entire operation. Despite the losses, the landing did not stop. New waves of Marines arrived on the shore, often coming under the same fire as the first ones. Medics worked tirelessly, pulling the wounded out from under the bullets. The sand quickly lost its black color, mixing with blood. By the end of the first day, the Americans had managed to secure a foothold on part of the island, but the price was terrible. Iwo Jima was not broken, nor was it even seriously weakened. The Japanese defenses remained almost fully functional. The enemy did not attempt to counterattack, it waited, allowing the Americans to advance slowly and at great cost. The first hours of the landing destroyed any remaining illusions. It became clear that Iwo Jima would be unlike any previous battle. This was not a fight for a beach or a breakthrough of defenses. It was a war of attrition, where every meter of land would have to be bought with human lives. The Americans remained on the island. This meant only one thing: the worst was yet to come. After the first days of fighting, it became clear that Iwo Jima was not an island in the usual sense, but an entire underground world disguised as a volcanic desert. What the Americans saw on the surface was only a thin shell. The real war was going on underground, in the darkness, narrow corridors, and caves, where time lost its meaning and space was reduced to a few meters. The Japanese defense on Iwo Jima was unique. Instead of sending soldiers on suicidal attacks on the beaches, the command focused on survival and maximum exhaustion of the enemy. The island was riddled with dozens of kilometers of tunnels connecting bunkers, artillery positions, ammunition depots, and command posts. Soldiers could disappear from under fire in an instant and reappear in another place where they were not expected. This came as a shock to the Americans. A destroyed firing point often came back to life after a few hours. After a bombing, it seemed that the position had been neutralized, but as soon as you got closer, fire was opened again from the same opening. The Japanese waited, allowing the Americans to approach to a deadly distance, and only then struck accurately and without warning. The battle turned into a slow, exhausting advance. Every hill, every crack in the ground could hide the enemy. The Marines no longer moved in wide lines. They learned to fight in small groups, clearing the territory meter by meter. Flamethrowers, grenades, and explosives became the main tools of this war. This was not just a tactic, it was a necessity. The psychological pressure was no less terrifying than the physical losses. Japanese soldiers often opened fire at night, trying to prevent the Americans from resting. They used the darkness, the sound of the wind, even the cries of the wounded to sow fear and disorientation. For many Marines, sleep became more dangerous than combat. Every night could end in a sudden attack. The American command gradually realized that standard methods of warfare did not work here. Artillery and aviation remained important, but they could not destroy the underground network. Each tunnel had to be taken manually. This meant entering the darkness, where the enemy knew the terrain better, had prepared positions, and did not plan to come out alive. Casualties grew daily. Soldiers died not only from bullets and explosions, but also from exhaustion, dehydration, and nervous strain. Iwo Jima blurred the line between day and night, between battle and respite. It gave no respite. Even those who survived began to change, becoming more silent, looking different, reacting more slowly. For the Japanese defenders, this underground war was the realization of their plan. They knew they would not win in the classical sense, but they believed they could force the U.S. to pay a price that would change the future decisions of the American leadership. Every day of defense was seen as a success, every enemy loss as a duty fulfilled. Underground, Iwo Jima ceased to be a geographical object. It became a closed space where people fought not for strategic points, but for survival in each specific moment. There were no quick victories or spectacular breakthroughs here. There was only slow, bloody work that gradually broke both sides. By the middle of the battle, it became clear that Iwo Jima would not surrender quickly. It would resist until the last tunnel was destroyed and the last defender was killed or incapacitated. This war no longer had anything to do with maneuvers and plans. It became a test of the limits of human endurance. Mount Suribachi towered over Iwo Jima as a constant reminder that the island was not broken. Its dark silhouette dominated the southern part of the battlefield and psychologically pressured American soldiers from the first day of the landing. From its slopes, the Japanese watched every move of the Marines, adjusted their artillery fire, and delivered precision strikes on the beaches. As long as Suribachi remained under Japanese control, no part of Iwo Jima could be considered safe. The American command understood that without capturing Suribachi, the battle would drag on even longer and casualties would mount. However, storming the mountain was no easy task. The slopes of the volcano were riddled with tunnels, caves, and hidden positions. Japanese soldiers did not maintain an open defense, they waited, allowing the Americans to approach, and then opened fire from a minimum distance. Every meter of the ascent turned into a separate battle. The advance upward was slow and exhausting. The Marines moved in small groups, using grenades, explosives, and flamethrowers. The battle was not for the summit itself, but for individual caves, ledges, and tunnel entrances. Often it seemed that a position had been cleared, but a few minutes later, fire would open again from the same area. Suribachi resisted as if it were a living creature. The Japanese defenders of the mountain fought silently and methodically. They did not counterattack en masse or rush into battle with cries. Their strategy was to delay the Americans as long as possible and inflict maximum casualties. For them, Suribachi was the last line of honor, a symbol that the island had not yet fallen. Day after day, the Americans tightened the ring around the mountain. Every success came at the cost of lives. The wounded were carried down under fire, often without the possibility of rapid evacuation. The sun, volcanic dust, and the stench of gunpowder and corpses made the air almost unbreathable. Suribachi was no longer just a hill, it had become a test that changed people. When the Marines finally reached the summit, it was not a triumphant moment in the classic sense. There was no sense of the battle being over, no certainty that the worst was behind them. Japanese resistance continued throughout the island. But the symbolic significance of the moment was enormous. The raising of the American flag atop Suribachi became an image that spread around the world. To civilians in the U.S., it looked like a sign of victory, proof that the battle was almost over. In reality, for the soldiers on Iwo Jima, it was only a brief respite. They knew that the real struggle was still going on, in the tunnels, in the north of the island, in every crack in the ground. The moment the flag was raised did not stop the fighting or change the course of the battle instantly. Japanese positions continued to fire, and soldiers continued to die. But the psychological effect was enormous. For the Americans, it was confirmation that the island could be broken. For Japan, it was a signal that even the strongest positions were not eternal. Suribachi was taken, but Iwo Jima was not yet conquered. The summit became a symbol of hope for some and a symbol of doom for others. The war on the island continued, even more brutal and exhausting than before. Ahead lay the north of Iwo Jima, a labyrinth of fortifications that would claim thousands more lives before the battle came to an end. After the capture of Suribachi, the war on Iwo Jima did not become easier, on the contrary, it entered its most brutal phase. The north of the island turned into a continuous defensive labyrinth, where every hill, every ravine, and every rock crevice concealed death. There was no longer any question of quick maneuvers or breakthroughs. Advances were measured in tens of meters per day, and sometimes in a few meters per hour of bloody combat. American units gradually lost track of time. Day and night merged into one continuous cycle of tension. Artillery strikes were followed by short attacks, after which silence filled with anticipation returned. Japanese soldiers used every pause to regroup, change positions, and disappear underground again. It seemed that the island's defense had no center, it was everywhere. The north of Iwo Jima had no symbols like Suribachi. There was no single hill whose capture could change the course of the battle. Every position was equally important and equally deadly. The Americans were forced to wage a methodical, almost mechanical war, clearing the territory step by step, without expecting quick results. Casualties were mounting. There were so many wounded that evacuation could not always keep pace with the fighting. Medics worked to the limits of their physical and psychological capabilities. For them, Iwo Jima was an endless stream of human suffering that continued day and night. Every life saved was a small victory, but the overall picture remained bleak. Japanese resistance did not weaken. The island's defenders continued to fight with the same cold determination as in the early days. They did not seek counterattacks in the classical sense. Their goal was to draw the Americans into battle, forcing them to expend strength, time, and manpower. Every tunnel destroyed opened the way to another, every position cleared turned out to be only part of a larger system. The psychological pressure became almost unbearable. The soldiers grew accustomed to the constant threat, but that did not make it any less real. Every sound could mean an attack, every shadow could mean an enemy. Many Marines later recalled that Iwo Jima was the place where they stopped counting days and started counting survival. The American command gradually changed tactics in an attempt to reduce casualties. More and more attention was paid to coordination between infantry, artillery, and tanks. However, even the best coordination could not completely neutralize the advantage of defense. The island seemed to have been created for defense, its rocky structure absorbed explosions and hid the enemy. Despite this, progress was being made. Slow, bloody, but inevitable. Japanese positions fell one after another. Tunnels were destroyed, ammunition depots exploded, and communication between units was severed. The island's defenders lost their ability to act as a single unit, although individual groups continued to resist to the last. This phase of the fighting revealed the true cost of Iwo Jima. It did not yield quick strategic results or bring instant relief. It only slowly wore down both sides, proving that the war in the Pacific had reached the limits of its brutality. As the fighting in the north of the island began to die down, it became clear that the end was near. But it would not be clear-cut, nor would it come in an instant. Iwo Jima had not yet had its final say. At this stage of the battle, Iwo Jima was no longer a battlefield in the classic sense. It had become a place of exhaustion. There were no longer clear lines of attack or defense, no defined phases or sense of forward movement. The island was slowly dying, and with it, people on both sides of the front were breaking down. American units continued to advance, but the momentum was lost. Each new day was similar to the previous one: clearing positions, sudden shots from underground, losses, a short rest, and then battle again. Soldiers no longer asked how long the operation would last. They only asked if they would survive the next night. Japanese resistance began to lose its organization, but not its ferocity. Individual groups of defenders acted autonomously, without communication with their command, without any chance of reinforcements. They came out of the tunnels at night, attacking the wounded, rear units, and medics. These attacks had no strategic sense, but they continued to inflict casualties and maintain an atmosphere of constant danger. The Americans responded methodically and ruthlessly. Any suspicious area of land was shelled. Any cave was destroyed. Flamethrowers, explosives, and artillery became common tools of daily work. The battle lost all its romanticism. It was a cold, difficult routine in which the main goal was to survive and destroy the enemy before he destroyed you. The psychological state of the soldiers deteriorated. Many suffered from insomnia, nervous breakdowns, and apathy. Even those who remained physically unharmed were broken inside. Iwo Jima did not allow them to get used to war. It constantly changed the form of the threat, forcing them to be on guard every second. For the Japanese defenders, the situation was becoming hopeless. Ammunition was running out, there was nowhere to treat the wounded, and water and food were on the verge of disappearing. But surrender was not an option. Many continued to fight, guided not by orders but by their own understanding of duty. Iwo Jima became a place where war finally separated from politics and turned into a personal choice, to live or die, but not to surrender. At some point, the American command realized that organized resistance no longer existed. The island was broken up into isolated pockets of resistance that could not change the overall course of events. However, even this did not mean a quick end to the fighting. Each such pocket could take a few more lives before falling silent. It was during this period that Iwo Jima began to be associated not with victory, but with cost. For the soldiers, it became the line beyond which the war ceased to be something abstract. It became personal. Many later said that it was here that they first felt true fatigue from the war, not physical, but deep, internal. When the intensity of the fighting began to subside, it did not bring relief. On the contrary, the silence became even more disturbing. It meant that the enemy could be somewhere nearby, waiting for the right moment. The island had not yet been completely cleared, and every day could be the last. Iwo Jima was still holding out. But now it was clear, it was holding out not because of strength, but because of stubbornness. The end of the battle was approaching, and with it came the realization that this victory would be unlike any other. When, in March 1945, the American command declared Iwo Jima captured, this decision was more administrative than real. Formally organized resistance had been broken, key areas of the island were under the control of the Marines, and Japanese units no longer operated as a single entity. But the war on the island was not over yet. It had simply lost its form. Even after the victory was announced, American soldiers continued to die. Individual Japanese defenders, cut off from their command and deprived of any hope, remained in tunnels and caves. They came out at night, fired from ambushes, and blew themselves up along with their enemies. For them, the battle had no end date. It continued as long as there was at least one bullet left or the strength to pull the trigger. The Americans were forced to comb the island with the same caution as in the early days. Every cave was checked, every tunnel was destroyed. It was dangerous and morally exhausting work. Soldiers who had already survived the worst now had to remain on guard, with no sense of completion. Victory brought no relief, only fatigue. The island looked dead after the fighting. The volcanic landscape was torn apart by explosions, covered with debris from equipment, weapons, and bodies. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and decay. Iwo Jima had no civilian population, but even without it, it looked like a place from which life had disappeared. There was nothing to rebuild here, only to clean up and bury. For American soldiers, the realization of victory came slowly. Many looked at the island and could not understand what exactly they had won. A piece of land with no cities, ports, or population had cost thousands of lives. This raised difficult questions that had no easy answers. Iwo Jima became not a symbol of triumph, but a symbol of the price that had to be paid. Japanese losses were almost total. Only a few of the entire garrison survived. For Japan, Iwo Jima became an example of ideal defense from the point of view of honor, but at the same time a tragic confirmation of the hopelessness of war. The island did not stop the American advance or change the strategic balance in Japan's favor. It only delayed the inevitable. The American command quickly began to use the island for its intended purpose. Air bases were built almost immediately after the fighting ended. Damaged bombers began to make emergency landings, saving their crews. From a military point of view, this confirmed the correctness of the decision. But for those who fought on the island, this logic did not always seem convincing. The end of the fighting on Iwo Jima was not a celebration. There were no mass ceremonies or a sense of historic victory. There was only an order to prepare for the next operation. The war continued, and Okinawa loomed ahead, even bigger, even bloodier. Iwo Jima was left behind, but it did not disappear from memory. It became a place that was impossible to forget. A place where the war had reached its limit, and victory no longer seemed like something bright. When the smoke over Iwo Jima began to clear, it was time for a cold calculation. The battle, which lasted just over a month, left behind not only a devastated island, but also a new reality of war in the Pacific. The results of this operation were complex, controversial, and far from as clear-cut as one would like to see on staff maps. From a military point of view, Iwo Jima had fulfilled its purpose. The Americans had gained airbases, which immediately began to operate. Damaged bombers returning from raids on Japan were able to make emergency landings, saving thousands of crew members' lives. Escort fighters could now cover B-29s over a much larger section of the route. The air war over Japan became more effective, more accurate, and less risky for American aviation. The island also became an important logistics hub. It shortened distances, sped up operations, and allowed the U.S. to act with greater confidence on the eve of the decisive stages of the war. From a strategic point of view, this meant one thing: another barrier between the U.S. and Japan had been removed. The chain of defensive islands on which Japan relied was falling apart. But these military advantages came at a terrible price. American losses at Iwo Jima were among the highest of the entire war for the Marine Corps. The number of dead and wounded shocked even experienced commanders. For many units, Iwo Jima became the bloodiest episode in their existence. Almost every family connected to the Marine Corps felt the effects of this battle. For Japan, the outcome was even more tragic. The island's garrison was virtually wiped out. It was almost a complete annihilation of people who knowingly went to their deaths, carrying out orders that had no real strategic value. Iwo Jima did not stop the American advance, did not force the U.S. to reconsider its plans, and did not give Japan enough time to turn the tide of the war. It only showed how far the Japanese army was willing to go and, at the same time, how hopeless its position had become. The battle also changed the American vision of the future invasion of the Japanese islands. Iwo Jima became a warning. If a small, uninhabited island cost so many lives, what would await the main islands of Japan, where every city and every village could be turned into a similar fortress? These questions began to be asked more and more loudly in U.S. military and political circles. It was after Iwo Jima that estimates of future losses during a possible invasion of Japan became truly frightening. Hundreds of thousands, and possibly millions, of casualties on both sides no longer seemed like an exaggeration. Iwo Jima gave these figures a real face, the faces of soldiers who died for a few square kilometers of land. American society had mixed feelings about the outcome of the battle. On the one hand, there was pride in the Marines, their endurance, and their victory. On the other hand, there were more and more questions about the price of this victory. The photos from the top of Suribachi became a symbol of heroism, but behind them lay a reality known only to those who had been through Iwo Jima from the first day to the last. In the end, Iwo Jima was not so much a triumph as a warning. It showed that Japan would not surrender easily and that every subsequent step towards its shores would be even more costly. It was a result that could not be ignored. The battle for Iwo Jima ended, but its consequences did not end with the last shot fired. They spread in waves far beyond this small island, affecting strategic decisions, political choices, and the collective memory of an entire generation. Iwo Jima was not just an episode in the war, it was a turning point, after which the world began to view war differently. For the United States, Iwo Jima became a point of profound rethinking. Military plans that had previously seemed logical and feasible now looked different. A direct invasion of the Japanese islands was no longer seen as the next step in the campaign. It became a scenario for disaster. What happened at Iwo Jima showed that Japan was ready to defend itself to the last soldier, the last bullet, and complete destruction. It was after Iwo Jima and Okinawa that Washington finally realized that a classic victory could be too costly. Loss estimates were no longer abstract. They were based on real experience, on names, on lists of the dead. Iwo Jima was one of the factors that prompted the U.S. to seek alternative ways to end the war, even if those ways were morally and politically difficult. For Japan, the consequences were even more dramatic. Iwo Jima did not save the country, did not stop the bombing, and did not provide a strategic advantage. It only confirmed that a strategy of self-sacrifice could not change the balance of power. The war was entering its final phase, and Japan was faced with a choice that was becoming increasingly difficult with each passing month. On a global level, Iwo Jima influenced post-war thinking. It became an example of how far war can go when neither side is willing to back down. It was battles like these that shaped the belief that future conflicts cannot be resolved by force alone and that the world needs new mechanisms for deterrence and cooperation. For veterans, Iwo Jima remained forever. Many returned home physically, but not emotionally. The island became part of their dreams, memories, and silence. They rarely spoke about what they had experienced because words were too weak to convey what they had seen. Iwo Jima taught them what neither schools nor armies teach, the value of life in conditions where death becomes commonplace. Iwo Jima is etched in human memory through one image, the flag at the top of Suribachi. For some, it is a symbol of heroism and victory, for others, a symbol of loss and suffering. But the true meaning of Iwo Jima lies deeper. It lies in the fact that this island showed the true face of war, without embellishment or legend. Iwo Jima did not bring peace. It only brought it closer by showing the price at which it could be achieved. It became a reminder that even the smallest points on the map can change the course of history if the will, fear, and determination of entire nations converge on them. When the war in the Pacific ended, Iwo Jima remained silent. But this silence was filled with memory. The memory of people who knew they could die and still went forward. That is why the story of Iwo Jima is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of a line that humanity must never cross again.